Welcome to the Sano Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the co-founder and CEO of Sano. Our guest today on the podcast is Dr. Lasse Folkersen. Lasse is a scientist at the Sankt Hans Hospital in Copenhagen in Denmark. In addition to his research into psychiatric conditions, Lasse runs a very cool website called ImputeMe or impute.me, which allows people who've already done genetic testing from a company like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA to upload their data and learn more about themselves using a technique called imputation and polygenic risk scores. It's really great to have you on the podcast today, Lasse.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So would you mind just telling us a little bit about your research background and why you decided to start ImputeMe in the first place?
Right, yeah. So I am a geneticist, and I've been working in that since 10, 15 years. And so in the field of genetics is, of course, many things. For me, I've been very, very much involved in all the genome-wide association studies. And that has a lot of implications for what we're going to talk about today, because it's that's what you do for common disease, right? As opposed to genetics of a family with a rare disease going from one gene to, and you know what gene that is. So that's my background, doing these genome-wide association studies. But it also kind of motivates why now I'm interested in actually using them for something, for a person, for a user.
Yeah. So would you mind just explaining to everybody what a genome-wide association study is?
So a genome-wide association study, that's actually very easy to explain. You take a bunch of people who has one trait that could be a disease, say schizophrenia, and then you compare that to a bunch, and I mean a bunch, like
hundreds of
thousands of people. And then you go snip by snip, genetic variation by genetic variation, and ask, is this more frequent in the cases than in the controls? And that's it, actually. So but it's a little bit of a technological thing that happened about 10 years ago, that we could do it. Before we couldn't. And it's also a little bit different than what you say, more classical linkage genetics, where you go like, this is how it goes in the family. It
Right.
doesn't find stuff where like you have the mutation, you have the disease for sure. It's more statistical, more modulations of risk, so on and so forth.
Right. And that makes the communication really challenging sometimes, right? Because it's not you have it or you don't, but it's a risk.
Yeah.
So along that thread, could you give us some examples of what things are actually very well predicted by some of the findings from genome-wide association studies, and which things are actually still very difficult to predict?
So I think it's good to say when we have this genetic expectation, everything is poorly predicted compared to say some monogenic disorder. We sequence you, we find it here, now we have the answer. Everything is more poorly predicted than that. But for sure we're better at some stuff than others. I work in mental disorder research myself, so I'm going to quote most of the examples from there. To give an example, schizophrenia, awful disease, highly heritable, right? Also well investigated. There, the polygenic risk scores, meaning how well can we use this, they don't even close to stand up to a monogenic disorder, but there's starting to be some glimpse of, hey, you can maybe soon-ish use this. Whereas another big mental disorder, such as depression, not so heritable, we are getting there with the genome-wide association studies. They're big right now, but it's not like as big. No,
It's
like you can almost not say anything about it.
Yeah, we had Catherine Lewis, who you work with, on a previous episode, and she said that if a direct-to-consumer test tells you they're going to predict whether you have depression or not, you should stay away from that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in your explanation there a polygenic risk score, and that's something that you do a lot of work on. Do you mind explaining what that is to people who don't maybe aren't familiar with the term?
Yeah, sure. So it's a fancy name for the actually very obvious idea that if you have a lot of genetic variation, many different mutations, SNPs, well, then you just sum it up and give you a score. That's it. It seems trivial to say it like that, but I think it's worth putting a lot of words on that, and it's a lot of my motivation also, because it's a new thought still in the world of consumer genetics and personal genetics, because I think maybe it's just a history thing that you so often read in the media. You have the gene for this, or you have the gene for that, and maybe that's true for some of those rare inborn diseases. But it's just basically for any disease that you know the name of, that's not gonna be it. The world is too complex, right? It's a sum of a ton of different effects. Many are environmental, and yeah, not so surprisingly, actually, many different are genetic as well.
Right. So to one of the examples, I think, so we can take on Impute Me, for example, you show predictions of people's height based on their genetics, right? Do you know how many different genetic positions are involved in height? It's probably thousands, right? At this point,
Thousands, 10,000s. It's like, and it's an
everything.
increasing number, and it's also like a little bit of a fluid border, like where do you set the cutoff? But yeah, I don't remember the number. I think it's
Right.
10,000.
But the predictions of that are actually getting pretty good, right? So but it's I guess it's because it's a trait that's measured in everybody in every single study that's ever done, right? So you have millions of people where you can try to predict their height from genetics, right?
Exactly that, and then also that height is very heritable. That helps a lot. So.
Right. Yeah. So same with BMI, I guess, as well. It's also pretty good. But I think schizophrenia and depression, there are now hundreds of different SNPs that are associated, and each one might add 1 or 2% to your risk, right? And so that what the score that you describe basically does is say you might have 55 SNPs that push you in one direction and 45 in another, and you add the amount that they push you, and you basically come out with a net positive or negative, right? Is that about right?
That's exactly that. And I think to all listeners out there that are dabbling a little bit in personal genetics, I think this is so important, because there's so many apps out there, analysis platform, that I just feel they don't get this. And then you have these poor people discussing on Facebook or Reddit or whatever, going, I had 13 risk SNPs for schizophrenia, and then I had 10 good ones. Oh no, oh yes, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know exactly.
Like, you have to sum it up, right? You have to figure out how many goods, how many bads, and that is what a polygenic risk score is, essentially.
Yeah, so talk me through Impute Me. How did you decide to start it, and who's it for?
It started out, and I'm not kidding you here, it started out as a personal project for my family. I was just so interested in.
Actually, I think I read somewhere you've gotten genetic tests for your whole family or something that, right? How many people is it?
It's all living.
All living Folkersens.
Folkersens, up from my daughter, my only child at the time, and it became kind of like this infatuation. I want to find out about her. It's nothing medical, but it's just she's half Chinese, and people kept asking me, she doesn't look very Chinese, and
right?
I so wanted to give it.
So now you have proof.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm not even sure I got proof, but it like one thing took another, and 23andMe was starting up at the time,
right?
That's good.
Well, and the interesting thing about even a simple statement like she's half Chinese, there's a lot of debate going on around the ancestry testing, because what does that even mean? You know, your most recent ancestor is from China, but maybe they came from somewhere else in the world. Exactly, so what does it even mean is the question.
Exactly. I think that the whole box of ancestry, personal genomics, is something that's really big, and I think it drives a lot of the sales, I think, of the testing companies. For me, there was a question, but it was never really the motivation. I'm more interested in the health genetics and with polygenic scores of common complex disease.
So you started this out of personal interest, basically, and then realized that lots of people actually had that same interest.
I did, and actually it started because of hair color, and hair color is just actually, when it comes to it, is actually pretty nice example of a polygenic trait. There is these. Okay, if you have that SNP, you will be dark haired if you have the two alleles from, say, Asia. But everything else is a palette, right? And I like that. Already there, when I said that hair color is a palette, people go, yeah, of course it is. It's many different colors. But they also get how a palette is mixed up by many colors and many different tubes. Well, there you have it. That's many different genetic variations. So it's a
Right.
very, very easy to explain setup. And then you can say, okay, so everything you just got about hair color, it's a palette of many snips, puts you in many different directions, more red, more dark, less dark. Hey, you know what? It's the same with a complex disease.
That's interesting. Yeah, so even something like that depression or schizophrenia, you could think of it as it's a palette of different changes. Maybe on a cellular level, there's something happening in your brain that is palette-like, and that it eventually manifests as something much more
Exactly.
complicated. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
interesting. And you actually do have the hair color palette on the site, right? Because I've used it, and I think I noticed that it will tell you, it'll give you the best guess of what your hair should look like based on
Yeah.
your genetics.
It's the most. It's still on. Sometimes I feel like I should remove it because it really, really illustrates when you're wrong. But you know
Right.
what? I like that. I'm okay with people having laughs at Twitter about, hey, there's a redhead and I'm not. But yeah, you know what? That's gonna happen for a disease prediction as well. So why not?
Yeah, well, and I think what I really like about your approach is the very top of every prediction says, it's almost self-deprecating in a way, where you say, by the way, none of this we're really good at predicting, so this is for your interest only. Don't
Mm,
don't expect this to be perfect for your hair color. We're going to give you the best that
you
recent
can.
science has to offer, but it's not. Yeah, and you're giving it for free, so people can't complain, I guess, right?
Something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, so people, how does it work? People can basically go on the site. It only is for people who've done testing already, right? And they can
Yeah.
upload data and have basically a huge amount of new information to play around with.
Yeah, so the idea is that there is all these direct-to-consumer companies, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, my heritage. I shouldn't forget any, but there's a lot.
Yeah,
And
there are about 300, I think.
something like that. But most of them, the far majority, they sell microarray, genotyping microarray, and that little detail, yourself, it's often lost in translation. People just go, it's a gene test,
Right.
and that's fine for ancestry research probably. And then you have on the other side, you have the medical doctors who work with clinical genetics, and they don't like that, of course, because a microarray does not pick up a rare mutation.
Right.
And for me, I actually think, like, if you ever were going to use a microarray in health, well, then you should use it in common disease, because hey, those are the ones that are actually governed by multitudes of common SNPs, such as we have them from the genome-wide association study. So for me, it seems like a more obvious choice to use microarray for, and then we will, as technology proceeds, right, then DNA sequencing will hopefully take care of the
Yeah.
more rare stuff.
So when people upload their microarray data, it automatically gets imputed. Do you mind explaining to people what imputation is? It's a
Yeah,
yeah. Go ahead.
so the idea is that one challenge I can see in many other health sites that attempt to do this is the many different formats used by the many different consumer companies. So maybe 23andMe measured that SNP, and maybe Ancestry.com measured
They
that
did it
other
right.
SNP, and it's like, it's hard to get into something useful, and people just go like, well, okay, so it's not measured, what can I use it for then? But then some smart people, who are not me, they invented a method called imputation, genetic imputation, and what it does is that it uses the fact that we know so much about human ancestry, that even though I might not have measured like large segments of my DNA, then I can guess that, okay, I'm probably from this or that lineage of humanity, quite detailed actually, and then I can fill in the blanks to some degree of certainty. And it's not gonna be as good as the direct measurement, but it's gonna solve that whole big problem, that is that if you want to just be able to accept data from any microarray type, well, you've got to have some level of standardization, because otherwise you will end up with, well, all 23andMe users, they scored really high for diabetes, whereas the same data coming from
Right.
MyHeritage users scored low.
Could be different.
That would be really awful, right? So it's a fancy technique, but it's really just meant to fill in the blanks and standardize between different direct-to-consumer testing companies.
Right. So you get kind of the same standardized output no matter what you put in, but you also get way more information, right? Because it uses, like you said, the uses a lot of whole genome sequence data where you know all the gaps in between and kind of fills in the blanks. I've heard it explained before as like if you have a book that you know really well, if somebody were to tell you just one word every 100, then you could fill in the blanks if you happen to know the book really well, and you can tell which chapter it was from. For example, if you just had a few snippets of different sentences.
I like that.
It's a stretch, isn't it?
No, I like the analogy. I would like to add, like, it's kind of like the crucial piece of information you would have to get, that you have to detect, is what language is the book written in as well, because that's how we fill in the blanks. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. And
absolutely.
That is essentially imputation as a technology, and it's virtually used in every single modern genome-wide association studies today. But for the individual user, it is really just a standardization measure to make sure that you can at least to some degree compare if you came with data from 23andMe or MyHeritage, and that's it.
Right. And so to take it back to the beginning, you originally started the site for yourself and your family, and then what made you decide to say, actually, let me open this up to the world? Did you tell people about it and they just said, actually, that would be really interesting for me as well, or how did that go?
First, I want to thank a few enthusiastic users in the beginning that, like, just, nerds like me who heard about it. Hey, this is really useful, and could you do like this? And then it sort of become like, well, people can use this. I'm gonna do that as well. But in a bigger picture, I also want to say, for me, I have been following a lot this debate about regulation of personal genetics, right? And I do have some opinions that I always felt it was maybe not so smart for the greater good that we limit what can be said, because as happened, for example, 23andMe got this FDA warning letter saying, no, you cannot say this or that. And,
right.
And unfortunately, what happens, I think, even though it was never the intention, is that it kills all the serious players and leaves the less than serious players, and nobody wins from that.
I think I've heard you. I think you mentioned this maybe I saw you give a presentation once, that often people make the argument that if you give people this information, they may not know what to do with it. But all you have to do is Google genetic testing depression, genetic testing breast cancer, and you'll find plenty that's out there, right? So it's almost like a lesser of two evils. If you can have a scientist that's taken the time to put it out there, and people are going to find it anyways. Is that more or less the argument?
Exactly, something like that. Because all these tests that people take, even though it's pitched as a ancestry test and that's it, right there, it's the same technology, it's the same genes that's measured. You can download the raw data, and you could actually sit and read it off yourself.
And you can take it to, there are lots of services online. I mean, we had Craig from DNA Testing Choice, which is kind of TripAdvisor like reviews of genetic tests. And he said there's more than 300 providers that now sell more than 3,000 tests. And the vast majority of them don't do the kits. They just take ancestry tests and run them through algorithms. And there's very little regulation on those, right? It'll just say, it'll spit something out and say, if you have any questions, go talk to your doctor. And the doctor certainly has never heard of the test before. One thing that I thought was really interesting about ImputeMe is that you have a pretty different stance on data privacy. You, if I'm correct, basically say we're going to delete your data within 14 days. And what was the thought behind that? That rather than save it for research or worry about consent or those sorts of things, you just say, this is for exploration. We're going to make it very simple and then you don't have to pay for storage costs, I guess, as well.
Well, there you said it.
Yeah.
I,
Is it
I,
a practical?
I save a lot of storage, but it's not only that. It's also like I'm in it for interest and drive for trying to discover new stuff. In some ways, I guess it would be an advantage if I had all the data. I could make a study, but in the end, I'm never gonna be able to build a database of people that's better than, say, a UK biobank or a
Right.
professional GWAS study. Never. And it's just going to give me a lot of regulatory headache. So the decision was actually pretty easy for me to just say, well, we take it by the European GDPR laws, and then my back is clear.
Yeah,
No,
you're covered. That's right.
and as you said, I also save a lot of money on storage costs. So
Yeah, what's about how big are these files once you've imputed them?
I don't know. I think it's 10 megabytes to upload, but then they explode, and then suddenly
Right,
they're like
they're 100 times the size or
something like that, and I can hang on to that for 14 days. But if I would hang on for all the users, another goal of this is to make it a robust self-funded thing. It runs on donations. I can do that because I'm very tight on the storage space and
Right.
the processing cost. I could not do that if I had to have a supercomputer standing behind it all.
You got started with a Kickstarter, right? I think it was about £1,000 or
Something like that.
10,000
No, not a
Danish
lot.
kroner, something like that, right? And then off you go.
Yeah, off I go, and then that was enough to fund a year of computing power, and that was basically enough. And the setup now is that it's free to run. Yeah, I'm actually pretty proud of that. So let me explain.
Yeah.
It's free to run, but if you donate $5 or similar, you get bumped in front of the line. And if you think about that, that's really well balancing, because if few people donate, I can't afford so many servers, and then
Right.
the queue gets really, really long.
And then
And
somebody gets
people
fed
get
up.
annoyed, and then
Yeah.
they start donate, and then the queue I can start more servers, and then the queue gets shorter, and then
That's
the
very
way I see
smart.
it's eternally balancing and robust, and not dependent on funders or investors or whatever.
Did you come up with that idea, or had you seen that working somewhere else?
Yeah, I have in basically all of biology, negative feedback.
Negative feedback loops, right?
So it's the same.
Yeah. Do you get people that come back to you to ask lots of follow-ups based on the information they receive? Because you give such a huge amount of information. Some of it is predictions of things like height, but then there are others that are, you do breast cancer risk, for example. Do you have people that come back and ask questions, or do people go elsewhere on the internet and there are loads of forums and those sorts of things?
I do. I'm not very strong on what you say user support. It's not and it's not just because I'm lazy. It's also a little bit. I don't want to cross that line into being a medical doctor. It's
Right.
if I sit there and you should take this or that medicine or do that. That's never and never will be the intention of it. On the other hand, working with medical doctors and a specific patient case, I think that's super interesting. But that's another matter. That's not something you just do as a answer an email kind of thing.
Right. Well, I think this is one of the really hard parts about direct consumer testing in general, is often there's a lot of work that's put into finding people, doing the test, but then the next step of what happens after you've got a result. We haven't quite worked it out I don't know if they've worked it out in Denmark, but they haven't worked it out here in the UK or in the US, as far as I can tell.
Oh, we have not either here. It's I just a few months ago published an article in the Danish Medical Doctors Journal. It's in Danish, unfortunately, but it's about preparing medical doctors like GPs, because inevitably they're going to be the first line for this.
Right.
I mean, that's how it always
That's how it always is. Exactly.
And there's no reason changing that system. People who have a worry about health, anything about their health, they're going to go there. And so I think there's a lot of education and giving out information for people, in plural, everybody, but there also will be for medical doctors. The good thing is that's nothing new. That's how it's always have been. That's what GPs do, right? They keep on top of stuff, and then they go, okay, this is how it is now. This is the latest in this field. In this case, then being genetics.
Yeah, and well, I guess we're interested in genetics, so we get very excited about these things. But eventually, it will just become another part of the healthcare system, right? You can predict somebody's risk of having a heart attack based on their cholesterol levels and their family history, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting genetics can help with that. But it's not the only thing, right? If you have to know all this other information, like do they smoke, do they exercise regularly, and it really is just a piece to the puzzle, except in some of the monogenic disease cases, right, where you get very damaging mutations.
Exactly. It's another piece of the puzzle. That's a good way to say it. And the monogenic diseases, well, you know what? You anyway have to go to the clinical genetics department and get a full DNA sequencing.
Yeah, that's right. So what's next for you on this? Are you adding new modules? Are you changing things up? Are you just excited about the fact that you can run it for free and you can just keep going indefinitely, or what's next on the horizon for you?
Right now, yes to that last thing, but I know then suddenly something new will happen and I'll get, this is exciting. I mean, it's small little optimizations, and that sounds boring in a way, but I think that's what works. That's what gives the ability to incrementally improve it. So right now, my big thing is that I want to move from 1,000 SNP scores to literally all the genome scores, because they are more predictive, even though you add in a lot of not so informative SNPs, but you know, they still contribute. But it's work intensive, and I just see it as a long road. Well,
this isn't even this is a fun side project for you, right? Most people, this could be a full-time job, but you're doing research full-time.
Yeah, I am, but you know, there's a lot of synergy to it. So
yeah, of course. What's your main research interest right now?
Well, my main research interest is genome-wide association studies. That's what I publish on, and will continue to publish on. And as I said, synergy. I mean, that just fits perfectly, right? It's
right.
The GWAS studies are the raw material, the summary statistics that you get out of that. That's going to be the output that you need as input for calculating
the polygenic scores.
Genetic risk, yes, the polygenic risk scores.
Right. Well, great. No, it's very fascinating. I don't want to take too much of your time, so just want to say thanks for the great conversation. It was really good to learn about what you're doing.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So if people want to keep in touch with you or follow your work, they can obviously visit the website. It's impute.me. You have a Twitter handle as well, right?
I mean, I don't see it as like opinions about stuff. It's basically like now there's the next update. That's what I use it for.
Right. So if they're really interested in keeping track of how this thing evolves.
I think there's something like 4 tweets per year.
Great.
I would say now I have listeners, and it's a good opportunity. What I would really like is it helps a lot when people find something they stumble on, or could be a bug, could be a mistake. Tell me. This is how.
Right, you have it. It's all on GitHub, right? So if anybody, and people can contribute too, right? Are you open to people helping out?
I'm very open, and in fact, now I'm talking to people in a greater audience. Please do.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so you can find it on impute.me. Thanks everyone for listening, and as always, you can send us any feedback that you have, including guests you'd like to see on the show, to podcast@sanogenetics.com, and we read and respond to all the emails. We'd love it if you could share the podcast with a friend or leave us a review on iTunes, whether you like it or not. Every bit of feedback helps. And then finally, you can feel free to check out our website, sanogenetics.com, to learn more about some of the research projects we're supporting, as well as some of these topics, including imputation, polygenic risk scores, as well as the genetics of mental health on our blog. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.